All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to my presentation. This is the Frugal Girl's Guide to Threat Intelligence. I am Rebekah Brown, PDX Beck on the Twitters. PDX is the airport code for Portland, Oregon. For those of you who don't know, it's the hipster capital of the world, home to man buns and bicycles and all things before they were cool, including me. I am currently the threat intelligence lead at Rapid7. I'm responsible for aggregating and managing and implementing threat intelligence across our product line, as well as with all of our services. It's a lot of fun. I have a lot of cool teams I get to work with. Our Metasploit team is amazing, and they help me come up with some really cool ways to generate and apply threat intelligence. Before that, I was a gunnery sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I was a Chinese crypto linguist and a network warfare analyst. My last position before I left active duty was the operations chief of the Marine Corps cyber unit, which is a lot of fun. And then I left and I went to go do some work with state and local governments. And I don't know how your systems are set up here, but our state and local governments, they are not super well funded. Not even for like basic things, and then you talk about cybersecurity and try and throw threat intelligence on top of that, and they're like, yeah, we've got a guy part-time who comes to make sure our computers work. Like, is that what you're talking about? So I learned there that I had to take some kind of novel approaches to threat intelligence and implementing that. And oh, yes, I am a 2-time kickball champion. I was told maybe I should take this out because apparently kickball isn't super cool here, but it actually isn't super cool in the US either, so I just left it in anyway. So why be frugal? Threat intelligence is a very expensive industry right now. When you talk about threat feeds and you talk about your threat platforms that you need to use the threat feeds, and then the people you need to interpret the results that were generated by the threat feeds through your threat platforms, and things start to pile on very quickly. So there's a couple different reasons that you might need to be frugal. The first, kind of the example when I work with state and local governments, is necessity. You don't have money, you don't have a budget, but you have a job to do, and people still expect that you're going to be doing things. So clearly, being frugal is really your only choice. Well, that or not getting out of bed in the morning, but that did not make for a very good talk. The second option is sustainability. Maybe you do have a budget, maybe you have some resources, some money, some people, but what turns out happening a lot of times is that we're kind of the victims of our own success. When you start doing something well, people expect more of you. They expect you to, tackle on more problems and provide more of what you were doing, and your budget might not necessarily scale with that. So in order to keep doing the kinds of things that are providing value to your organization, you might need to be frugal for that sense. And then the last one is doing things correctly. So a lot of times people think that the idea for this talk came solely from my experience working with companies or organizations with no budget. But honestly, it came from the opposite situation. One company I worked with had a crazy budget. One of those, anything you could think of, you could buy. You don't even really have to have a justification. Just be like, it looks cool and I want it, and they would buy it for you. And that is what they did about a month before I started. Spending spree, bought all the feeds, millions of indicators. It's going to be great. We're going to do all this threat intel. And then it fell on me, having chosen none of those tools, to show the return on investment for all of this huge amount of money they had spent. And it was really hard to do, because they did not go about purchasing all of these things in a good or pragmatic way, even to solve problems. It was just, hey, this looks cool, let's buy it, and then now do something cool with it. And that's the approach that I see a lot with threat intelligence. The step 1, buy intelligence. Step 2, do some things. And then 3, security. And people wonder why that actually doesn't work and why they aren't seeing the results they want. And that is because a lot of times when you go into it with that approach, you don't even know what you're doing. You don't quite know what threat intelligence is, except that it sounds cool and you want to do it. It has the word intelligence in it. It's like the emperor's new clothes, basically. You think you should do it, so you end up parading down the road with your millions of threat feeds, saying, look how great I am, when really you're not providing any value. So since the purpose of this talk is how to do what you can with what you have, whether you have a lot or a little, before you can do that, you have to understand what it is you're actually trying to do. So for this talk, I'm going to talk about the 3 different areas that I see people applying threat intelligence a lot. And again, I am a believer that threat intelligence is not a standalone function. It's not just like something you do. It is an enabler for all of the other aspects of your security program. And so 3 of the primary ones that we're going to talk about are SOC, the Security Operations Center, or the kind of the alerting use case, the incident response support use case, and then the strategic support case, where you're informing executives, not just your security executives, but also the business executives. They want to understand the threats that they're facing as well. And so for all these 3 different areas, and there's many more, you know, I've seen people use it with vulnerability management. I've seen them use it with like strategic business planning. But there are some places where it overlaps, the tools and the processes that you will use overlap, and there are some places where they're completely different. For example, if you're using a threat feed for your SOC and you're alerting, please do not use that to, you know, inform your executives about the threats facing you. You will lose them very quickly. So the first thing we're going to talk about is alerting for the SOC. And what this looks like is alerting on known threats. And I know a lot of people don't like talking about that because threat intelligence was supposed to get us out of the age of, you know, the signature-based detection, but that's really what it is. We know something's bad, and we're going to tell you if we see that. But what we want to do differently is we want to provide context on those alerts. We want to help people understand the threat behind that alert and what it might mean and what they might need to do. And we want to enable quick decision-making. If you're not making it easier for the SOC to understand and act on alerts, then you're not doing your job. Kind of one of my key tenets for whether or not this is successful is that if the SOC hates you, you're doing something wrong. Some of the resources, some of the Frugal or the free or very, very cheap resources you can use for this are threat lists, threat exchanges. There's a lot of open source tools. And then there are community versions of tools, which are, turns out is happening a lot, started out as open source tools and then got acquired by someone, and now they have a commercial version you can buy, but there's also still a free community version that you can have access to. So a quick note on threat lists and exchanges. They're not all created equal. Some are very good, some are bad. This is kind of the theme as we talk about everything in threat intelligence. There are good things and there are not so good things. The handling and the maintenance of these lists vary greatly, especially when we're talking open source lists. This is usually somebody's pet project or something they're doing because they are passionate about security or something they're interested in. And that their time that they can devote to those things changes. So you will see some threat feeds where every single day they're on it, every hour updating it. And then somewhere it's been a good month. So it's always important to kind of reevaluate and see what you're using. You need to have context. Again, if it's a list of IP addresses and you have no idea where it came from, just leave it alone. That's not what you're looking for. And they can be very useful if implemented correctly. So I took this yesterday. So Firehole is actually one of the resources I like the most for evaluating threat feeds and seeing what would be good. But right here, this is an example of the aggregate of all of these different lists, these hundreds of different threat lists that they keep an eye on and they kind of aggregate and monitor. And as of yesterday, there were 667 million IP addresses. Can you imagine if you took that entire list and plugged it into your SIM? That would be one of the situations where your SOC would hate you. I feel like they would be hunting you down at that point. So it's important to be aware of what's out there and figure out how to best handle it. So a good way to evaluate threat feeds, and again, this is from Firehole. So they have, if you ever go to the website, and I have my last couple slides have all of these resources on them, but they provide a lot of information and contextual information around the feeds themselves, which is really, really useful with figuring out what you're going to use. So here, for example, average update frequency, 1 hour and 1 minute. That's pretty solid. The last time it was updated by its maintainers. Again, that's how you go and check and make sure that this is a feed that is actually someone's paying attention to. It's not 2 weeks old or a month old, because especially when we talk about things like IPs and network-based indicators, they're not good for very long. If it's a month-old list, it's probably not going to do you a lot of good. And then this graph here shows the number of unique IP addresses they have on their list at any given time. And I really like this one, because if you remember the first one, like that's just flat. There's a little increase there right around like September 9th. But again, we're talking 667 million indicators, so it's hard to see. But here, clearly, sometimes there are more IPs, sometimes there are less. That shows that they're actually expiring them. When they do their updates every hour, they're not just adding more, it's not just accumulating. They're actually expiring ones that are no longer valid and putting in the new ones. So right here, we have 157 IP addresses. That's a much more consumable volume of indicators. But it gets better. So for this particular, that last graph was the open block list 1-day list. And they have like 7 days, 30 days, all eternity lists. So you can actually go through and refine what you're going to be pulling from based on what you need. And so here they actually provide where this information comes from, which is a critical thing that I think most people don't think about with threat feeds. That data comes from somewhere. A lot of times it's coming either from reports, like this one down here with the Apache block list. It's reports, IP addresses reported within the last 48 hours attacking Apache services. So that's great. And if you have those types of systems that you're monitoring, this would be a great list to use. If you don't use this. Why would you? But again, it's important to know where the data came from. I love how specific they are with the open block list as well. They tell you what specific ports they're monitoring for, that it's a honeypot, and they're looking for brute force attacks. They're looking for attacks against specific applications. When you have that type of information, it is much easier to understand how that fits into your overall security posture and whether you need to be using this list or whether you don't. And again, it also shows overlap. So a lot of feeds pull from other feeds. So there's a lot of cases where if it's a feed that's actually been ingested by another feed that you use, you don't need both. Or maybe you don't want the aggregated feed. Maybe you want to have that ability to say, I only want this small portion. But looking at that overlap, you start to understand a little bit more about just the nature of threat feeds in general. I also think it's hilarious. I still haven't figured out how it did this. But apparently that one has like over 100% of the IPs from someone else. I guess with free stuff, you get what you pay for. So there's a lot of feeds out there. There's hundreds and hundreds of feeds. And it can be very difficult to figure out which ones you should be using. You probably don't want just one. You probably don't want them all. You want a good mixture. And so one of the approaches I like to take is making a collection plan, which is sitting there and using the best threat intelligence tool out there, Excel, and saying, OK, what do I need? And so for this example, I kind of said, OK, these are the fields I want. These are the types of data that I want. You could be more specific. You could say, OK, these are all the systems we have on my network. I want to make sure I have threat lists that cover threats against all those systems. And then you just start going through all of your open source threat feeds, and you plot out where they fit. OK, this is where this one fits in. This is where this one fits in. You might start to see, well, hey, I have 67 different feeds that are targeting my Apache system, but I have nothing that's protecting my Windows systems. So maybe I need to look for something else. Or same thing, maybe there is a feed that you cannot find an open source feed at all that fits your needs. And that's when the bottom here is where I started looking into commercial or some of those more community tools. Sometimes you will need to go outside, and you won't always be able to use the open source or the free tools. But if you look at it like this, then you will get the right tools, and you'll be able to invest money in the right places. There's a couple other really cool tools out there that can help you understand whether or not the feeds you've chosen are good for you. There's these next two tools were built by the MLSec project, so Alex Pinto and Kyle Maxwell. This is the Threat Intelligence Quotient Test. And it is a bunch of really cool data science. It uses R, which kind of threw me off. I was a little afraid to use it at first. I just kept emailing Alex and saying, hey, run this data for me. And he finally told me how to use R. It's really awesome. You should probably look into it. But But you can run it against your own data sources, and it checks for things like overlap, it checks for things like novelty of indicators, and it can be useful for, again, determining whether or not you actually have the right sources that you're using. And the next tool I'll talk about, Combine, helps deal with this problem, the standards problem. How many people here have heard of Sticks? How many here think Sticks is awesome? Yeah, there's a couple, yeah. It's not terrible. I like it a lot more with this latest update where it's no longer in XML, it's now in JSON, so that makes me very happy. And then we have Cybox, which is a component of Sticks. We have OpenIOC. We have all these different standards that, again, were meant to solve this problem of competing standards, but we just end up with lots and lots of standards. So another tool they developed is called Combine, which takes all your different data in all its different formats, and it kind of reads through and parses it and does some data field mapping, and it puts it out in a standard format that you can use. There's a lot of commercial tools that will say they do this as well, but this is, it's on GitHub. Obviously, it takes some time. You have to have some Python skills to use it, but it is a really good alternative to some of these really pricey data feed ingestion services that are out there. It does some enrichment for MaxMind and Farsight DNS database. You have to have accounts, but I believe last time I checked, they did still have community accounts. Like I said, things change rather quickly in this world. And it integrates with crits, which we're going to talk about next. So threat intelligence platforms are, I think, the most recent, really, really expensive tool you can buy for threat intelligence. And they came about because people realized, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with my 3 million indicators that I just spent $2 million on? I can't just throw it right into my SIEM. That's craziness. What should I do? We need an intermediary platform to store all of these, and the threat intelligence platform was born. It's a terrible acronym. I wish they'd come up with a different term. But so Crits is an open source solution for that, and it started out as a malware analysis platform, and it was because people who were doing responding to a lot of incidents, doing a lot of analysis, kind of just stored the outputs of their data all over the place, and then anytime they wanted to kind of cross-reference or find out, oh, hey, I think I saw this before a couple weeks ago, where was it? They're searching through their email and their desktop, and did they put it in a Word file? So Crits became a place to store all of that. And then they gradually added indicators of compromise and some of the network-based stuff. And so you can use it to store, enrich, and discover threats. Has anybody here used or stood up Crits? It's not a super fun process. It's getting better. Again, it's one of those trade-offs when you're using open source tools, is you do actually have to put in the work and have some people who have the skills to stand it up and to maintain it. But it is actually a really useful tool. So my Frugal tips for SOC alerting. It's an investment even if it's free. And I know we have free as in beer. I like to refer to all my open source projects as free as in puppies, meaning sure, it might be free now, but you are now responsible for caring and feeding and cleaning up after that thing for the rest of its life. So just go into it with that mindset, and you won't be surprised when you realize that you have to stay up till 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning updating your servers. It's totally worth it, though. I know that sounds terrible, but it's worth it. One of the big issues is that, especially executives and a lot of CISOs like to say, oh, but I won't have that 0-day information ahead of everybody else. And I say, yeah, that's kind of the point of 0 days. Like, you don't know about it before it happens. So when you use open source information, there's that feeling that you're missing out on the good stuff. But a lot of the commercial threat feeds have a lot of the same data, pull from the same sources as the open source threat feeds. And honestly, do you really need to know about it, the split second it happens? Are you that good at patching? Are you that fast and that able to respond to threats that if you know about it 10 minutes after, the commercial vendor puts it out, that you're really at that much of a disadvantage? I think in all but a few cases, it really isn't that big of a deal that the information is public when you're using it. You're still able to use it, still able to respond. You have many options, so find out what works best for you. This is the best part about using free tools. If it doesn't work, Who cares? Find a new one. You're not locked into a 2-year contract that you're going to have to go back to your board of directors and show them how you're using it and how it's helping your company. Keep track of what's working and what isn't. Don't make somebody else reinvent the wheel. Don't make them go through the same pain you had when you stepped through your collection plan and figured out what feeds you should be using. Make sure you document it all in a place where you can refer to it in the future, and so you're helping other people as well. And again, if the SOC hates you, you're doing something wrong. So incident response support is the next area that I see a lot of people using threat intelligence. And again, this is another area where they have a lot of commercial tools that are very, very expensive. I'm talking like, oh gosh, I can't do conversion to pounds in my head right now. Okay, it's like 100,000 pounds for like 2 licenses. Yeah, it's like 150K. So yeah, I think I did that well-ish. Just for some of these tools that are basically pulling open source information. So there's a lot of ways you can either do that yourself if you don't have that money to spare, or again, if you just want to validate whether using open source information in this use case is something you're actually going to do and is going to benefit your organization. So I work with our incident response team a lot, and the primary tasks I do are validating their IOCs when they are going through logs and they're finding whether network-based or host-based artifacts. They send them my way, and I go through and say, okay, here's what I think this is, here's what it means. Identify additional things. Okay, if this is related to this malware family, here's some other things you might expect to find and provide that back to them. And then the key difference, though, is the incident responders, they want to identify and contain, they want to eradicate the threat. They just, they want to get rid of it. But threat intelligence can bring in an aspect where you're kind of understanding what were the attackers after. Was this a targeted attack? Was it casual? Did you just happen to have a horribly vulnerable web server and 15 different actors, hacked you at the same time? Providing information on those goals and motivations of the attacks is something that can help increase your security posture in the future. And it's also something that the executives really want to know about. They want to understand why this happened, why me, what did we do, what did they want. And you can actually, through doing a lot of this open source research, you can find out a lot of stuff about that. Again, some of our resources are open source intelligence, community tools, and then threat reports and blogs. The first thing I do when they send me an IP address is I check to make sure it's not a Tor exit node. Because there's a lot of, you can spend a lot of time digging into an IP address and trying to figure out, okay, I know who this is, and what's the who is information, and okay, where has this been seen? You can spend hours and hours spinning up on this. When it was, knowing that something was a Tor relay or Tor exit node is a good TTP, and it's a good thing to identify for the attacker, but it's really one of those, okay, let's stop looking into this IP. Let's not waste my time. We're being frugal not just with money, but with our time and with our resources. So Exonerator is the tool I use. And you have to know the IP address, and you also need to know the date. So just like the SOC doesn't like when we hand them a big old list of IP addresses, you should not like when your IR team just hands you a big list of IP addresses and said, tell me about these. You need to understand a little bit more about them as well. At the very least, what date? Is this yesterday? Is this 3 years ago? That's going to help you figure out a lot more about what's going on with it. Another tool I like, this was one of those community tools that was acquired, Passive Total was acquired by RiskIQ. They still have a community version. It has lesser functionality than the paid version. I think they have some of their commercial use terms, end user license agreement type thing. So look into it and make sure you're not using it in a way they don't intend you to. But it is a really good resource. So you can search for a domain or for an IP, and it will provide you information, first time seen, last time it was seen, where they're pulling their data from, which again is, and I love when people tell you where they get their data from, because then I know how to handle it, especially when you're doing open source. And then tags. So these are things that have been associated with this IP address. So here we're seeing, again, it targets Apache, and what else is it? So it's associated with brute force login attempts. So that's something you'd go back to your IR people and say, hey, for this IP address, this is the activity it's seen before. Does that line up with what you're seeing? Do you need to check other resources? Things like that. No talk is complete without me mentioning Maltego. I could do a whole entire talk on that. I feel like somebody is at this conference already, so I won't beat a dead horse. But Maltego has passive total transforms that are community transforms. So you, again, have to have a community account with a key, but it's not paid. And here you can pull the same information, all the registration information, and you can also pull the tagging information. So it's just another way to access that information. And I like doing it through Maltego because then I can pivot to other resources without having to go log into another platform. Some of the other things we're going to talk about, Threat Crowd, Threat Miner, they all have Maltego transforms as well. Back in Passive Total, they have a heat map functionality. And again, this is all the community version. So it can provide you some pretty cool information. For example, this IP address, which was the 72 IP address from before, we can see that it used to have a lot of domains associated with it. And then sometime in August, something changed. You can see now it's only got 1 or 2. So that can be something really interesting to look into and to be aware of from a threat intelligence perspective. And again, it speaks to why it's important that you have more contextual information like the date, when this attack was. Was it way back then when it was new domains popping up every time, or was it a more recent attack when things are pretty, it's narrowed down to 1 or 2? In addition, it pulls from places like VirusTotal and Emerging Threats, now on Proofpoint, to provide hashes and malware samples that are associated with that IP address as well. So that's, again, another place where you can pivot. And if you were to look at that first VirusTotal hit, you would see that it has a lot of different names. We can't get our act together and name things appropriately, but that hide link is kind of a commonality in a lot of them. So that might be another place where you can pivot and start to look for stuff. I have my malware analyst I work with. He hates anytime I call something a generic malware, because he tears that stuff apart. And he's like, that is not generic. It is, every malware is a special snowflake. And I have to say, no, it's okay. It's not me. It's those guys. I get it. But we can still get some information just from the names that these different antivirus vendors are providing. And so from here, we can see that it is a JavaScript that is running, clicking hidden links in the background. And we have a little more information about what this threat might be. And again, this is all stuff you should provide back to your incident response team. What was the nature of the threat? Where else has it been seen? When has it been seen? And then what does it target? Because that will help them narrow the scope of where they need to look next. Some other resources for investigating IOCs, Threat Crowd is a good one. Again, they provide things like domain and IP linking, malware hashes. I think they pull from VirusTotal and malware.com. But they also have a crowd-sourced, because you can see right there at that top circle, you can say, is this malicious? So if you're investigating this and nobody else has said it's been malicious before, you have that opportunity to contribute back and make someone else's job a little bit easier. When we talk about using blogs and things like that, if you are dealing with a piece of malware, you are on an investigation where there's nothing out there, nobody has written or talked about this before, that might be something that if you can get approval from your management and from your organization, whoever you're working for, just put something out there. It doesn't have to be a public blog. It can be part of like a trust group or community where you're sharing that information back. So now, next time, somebody else will have a little bit more information about it. It's kind of the whole open source ecosystem of providing back. Threat Miner is another one. It pulls from a lot more places, including Alien Vault's Open Threat Exchange, which is another a cool exchange. I don't think I talked about it much here, but it's another area where they kind of aggregate lists. They have community contributions, and they provide more context. And they actually now have private groups. So it used to be if you were sharing with OTX, you were sharing with everybody, and now they have the ability for you to say, like, well, here, this community within OTX is who I want to share this with. So it gives people kind of a little more comfort with sharing if it's something you think might be a little more sensitive. But the other cool thing about Threat Miner is, in addition to dealing with just like IOCs and those discrete pieces of the puzzle, you can also search APT Notes. And APT Notes is a repository of all of these threat reports that we've been publishing kind of en masse since, oh gosh, when did APT1 come out? Like 2011, I think? Yes, so they store it in a way that's searchable. So for example, you can search for the manufacturing industry, you can search by year. And that kind of goes to not just understanding, okay, what is this IP address? What is this malware sample? But understanding more about the actors who are using them and who are behind them, which again can help you go back to your overall goal, which is let me understand this attack. You know, threat intelligence has the opportunity to provide kind of that bigger picture view, and using things like APT notes can help you figure that out as well. Presenting the information. This is my new favorite tool. I just discovered this last week, and this is called Office Timeline, and it's like a plugin for PowerPoint. It only works on Windows, which made me sad, but hey, that's why we have VMs, right? But this is a feature I've always wanted, because it allows me to take the kind of the different events that our IR people focus on, like, okay, they did this, and then map it, in this case, the kill chain, which I did down here, kind of stepping through the different phases, and it provides a good visualization as to the actual life cycle of the attack. I used to not like the kill chain for a variety of reasons. I dislike that it's trademarked. I feel like that's a term that you can't really, I don't know, it's a military term, we use it all the time. But also, apparently, Oregon, Portland, hippie capital of the world, if you sit in a coffee shop and are on a conference call and you say the word kill chain 15 times quickly in succession, turns out they ask you to leave because you're scaring other customers. But again, I really like this. It has a lot of functionality. If you ever are in a position where you need to present something like this to executives or management, or even to help your own IR team understand kind of the threat intelligence approach and what we look at from this perspective, it's a good tool. And then storing the intelligence. Again, another threat intelligence platform. This is called ThreatNote. I really like it. It is, to be upfront, kind of in its beta version. There's definitely some additional functionality that I think the developers are trying to build into it, but it's really neat because unlike crits and MISP and the kind of very IOC-centric repositories, this allows you to capture information on threat actors and campaigns, which are different attacks or different intrusions with similar goals. It uses the diamond model. That's another good read if you're not familiar. It's the diamond model for intrusion analysis, which kind of steps through how to link attackers and infrastructure with their victims to identify campaigns and identify trends in attacks. So it is a kind of a more robust analysis platform rather than just kind of an IOC aggregation platform. And again, Brian Wareheim and Scott Roberts have been working on that. So kind of to sum up some of the tips for incident response, again, many sources of information on IOCs. Don't automatically assume that because you don't have access to a threat intel vendor's portal, which again costs lots and lots and lots of money, that you're on your own. There is a lot of information out there. There will be times when you hit a dead end. There will be times where you will not be able to find open source information on things, and that stinks. But again, kind of step through the traditional malware analysis approach and incident response approach and take all that information you learn, and if you're able, share it back out. So next time somebody is looking for it, they're actually able to find something. Aggregators like ThreatCrowd and ThreatMiner can help cut down on some of the work of going to all these different places individually. Identify if something is a legitimate indicator. Not everything is going to require a full-scale investigation by a threat intelligence analyst. And being able to figure out which ones to focus your time on and which ones to kind of just let go to the side is another way to make sure that you are being respectful of your resources and your time. Keep the big picture in mind. If they wanted you to be an incident responder, you'd be on the incident response team and not threat intelligence. So work with them, but try and make sure that you're not digging down too deep. Make sure you're maintaining a view of the overall attack so you can understand that better. And again, keep track of what's working and what isn't. And then the last aspect we're going to talk about is strategic support. I really like this aspect because with a lot of things, with the SOC, it's assuming you have some sort of logging and response capability. With incident response, it's assuming you have some sort of incident response capability. With strategic support, you really don't need anything else except a good head on your shoulders, and people who will listen to you. Again, those two things aren't always a given, but I hope that at the very least people have those things available to them. So when you're providing kind of the strategic support, and again, this is to executives and to business managers and things like that, you're targeting the business, the higher level. Again, you don't want to go in and talk about your latest malware analysis and how you're able to deobfuscate the C2 traffic. That is going to go right over their head, and they're not going to want to listen to you anymore. So make sure that you are scoping what you're presenting to them to the things that they care about. And again, you're providing an assessment of threats that have that strategic impact, and that might require some longer-term planning. So some resources we're going to talk about are the threat reporting, kind of APT notes that we had just talked about, some of the annual breach reports, and then internal data as well. We didn't talk about it much in the last two aspects, but your own data, your own logs, and information from previous incidents is really, really invaluable. So don't discount that. If you have access to that, you are far better off than anyone who just spent $1 million on a threat feed. So a quick note on threat reports. Many are good, some are not. Always remember that they're used for marketing purposes, for the most part. Even if it is a company who says, no, we don't sell this, we do this, we do research, they're still trying to build their brand, they still have some sort of angle. So just be prepared to look for those biases. They're going to want you to think that what they have to talk about is really, really important and really, really relevant to you. But you're the only one who can actually determine what is important. So keep that in mind as you read through things. All right, how to spot a bad threat report. It's always fun to make fun of Norse. Zoe, does anybody here work for Norse? Or used to? Okay. So this was a report that they came out with when we were in the middle of doing nuclear treaty negotiations with Iran. So a threat report like this can have very serious policy implications. And so what they came out and they said was, Iran has engaged in sophisticated cyber attacks against American industrial control systems, which then, clearly if they wouldn't have written it if it wasn't true. So Fox News, which I don't know if any of you are familiar with Fox News, but I have a hard time watching it without ugh. But they came out and they turned this into, there is a cyber terrorist army that is going to attack America. And then you read through the report and you realize these sophisticated cyber attacks were scanning activity over a 1-month period. And the attribution to Iran was from IP geolocation. And if you read through the report, they justified this by saying things like, oh, well, clearly when you're going to attack someone, well then you hide where you are and you go through hot points. But if you're just going to do your reconnaissance and scanning, well then the attackers go from their own IP address. Things where you're like, oh, okay. And then, things like, oh, yes, and then the second highest behind Iran were France and the Netherlands, and oh, we know that they have those crazy hackers there too, so got to watch out for them. The report did not make a lot of sense, but people who read it did not have the background we have. And so they were like, oh my goodness, clearly we're about to be attacked. This is a catastrophe. And luckily there were enough people who could read through and de-hype and bring out some of these facts and able to discredit them. And then they discredited themselves enough for the rest of us. So, all right, so that's how to spot a bad threat report. How do you spot a good threat report? So it will provide information on who's being targeted. There have been very few attacks that affect everyone, everywhere on the internet. It's always targeted at something, a country, a group, an industry, something. If it provides you some sort of information that helps you gauge who the victim is, that is really, really good. It provides a time frame. Just because they're reporting it now doesn't mean the attacks happened now. It could have happened 2 years ago, especially with the way our detection and incident response cycle works. It's probably much more likely that it was a long time ago. So again, this helps you understand if you need to look at yesterday's logs or 90 days logs. So it indicates where the information came from. A lot of times they will not be as upfront as some of the threat lists was saying, oh, this came from these specific systems or these specific locations. They want to protect their sources and methods. But you do need to be able to get some sort of idea whether it came from scanning data or whether it came from an incident response engagement where they have a lot more information. And there will be ways to tell within that how it was, where the data came from. You want to look for things that don't make analytic leaps. You do want some of that analysis. That's the reason that they have a job, is because they are threat analysts. So you want that analysis, but you want to be able to logically follow their steps and how they came to that conclusion. You don't want any of those crazy leaps. And then objective information. When you start seeing things like cyber terrorists and sophisticated attacks and things where, the adjectives that are very clearly trying to get you to think a certain thing, stay away from those. Stick with the ones that are objective and that kind of tell you the facts. Annual breach reports are another really good way to provide that kind of strategic level assessment. Things like, the DBIR, M-Trends that FireEye puts out, Symantec has their Internet Security Threat Report. I feel like we're going to be seeing more and more of these annual assessment reports, which are good because they all come from different data sets. The DBIR comes from kind of self-reported incidents, people who want to participate, or if they're the government are forced to participate, but it comes from that incident response data, whereas like the Symantec report comes from their sensors and the things that they are monitoring. So you have two different data sets, and it's kind of interesting to read over both of them and see how they compare, see what you can learn from one versus the other, and aggregate it into what it actually means from you. And these annual reports can provide a lot of answers to questions that your executives will have, such as, what are threats to organizations in our industry? What type of actors are targeting our industry or other organizations like us? What do they do? And then the big one, are we positioned to identify and defeat an attack? And that's something that you will only know if you work with your own organization, if you understand not only your security posture, but the threats against you as well. The DBIR also does industry snapshots. All the data is made available. So they have some, like this one's for the healthcare sector, that provides some specific examples about threats facing the healthcare sector, but all that information is out there. And again, if you have some R skills, which is what they use for the DBIR, you can very quickly pull the information for your particular sector or organization. There's a lot of different ways you can handle the data. It doesn't just have to be by industry. It can be like, okay, what about our geographical area or companies of a similar size to us? When you have some of that, the data science and the analysis skills, you can pull a lot of information, especially from the publicly available data sets. And then leverage your internal data. Don't just look outside. A lot of times, that's where threats come from, but we will have a lot more information on those threats from our internal resources. So the different business units, they know what is important to them. They know what would stop their operations or what would cause them to have a significant setback better than we do. In security, we like to think that we know everything. It's important to realize that we don't always know everything. Lawyers, no one wants to talk to them. But I know some lawyers, and they're actually very decent human beings, believe it or not. And they can provide a lot of information as to what you are required to protect, which again will help you figure out where you need to position yourself. Asset management, it's hard to protect what you don't, if you don't know what you have, if you don't know what type of systems you have. Hopefully you have asset management. If not, please focus on that before you do threat intelligence. Find out about previous incidents. What types of threats have you seen? Again, there is no better threat intelligence than the intelligence you've generated yourself. So be prepared to respond and to detect those types of threats, especially if it's something you've seen over and over again and it's kind of persistent and it's likely to come back again. And then third-party partners. A lot of times we're seeing people are not actually getting breached by their own networks. It's somebody they partner with. It's a third-party resource, going all the way back to Target and their HVAC vendors. But then we see things like the TeamViewer, which again, they say they weren't hacked, but again, those credentials allowed people access to their networks. So you didn't even have to do anything wrong, except maybe not have two-factor authentication. But you need to understand what those third-party connections are and how that extends to your attack surface. All right, so again, tips for strategic support. You have to understand your business in order to provide this type of support. So take the time to understand what's important, not just for security's sake, but for a whole business operating sake. And that way you can approach the threats from a place where you're actually providing value because you understand what's important to the business. Find threat reports that are relevant and unbiased. Again, not everything is going to be directly applicable to you, so look for the ones that are. And the more you read through them and the more you really dig into it and kind of look into some of the things that you think are good, relevant to you versus the ones that aren't, it'll become quicker to understand which ones to focus on. Learn from previous incidents. Build a threat model of your organization. That's another thing that kind of reading through all of these reports and the annual reviews, that will help you understand a lot more about the threats that are facing other organizations similar to yours that you might face, and it can help you build out a threat model. Talk to executives about what they care about, and use your strategic planning to support threat intelligence investment requests. And again, it all comes down to you don't want to always have to be, scramping and begging and borrowing and stealing resources. If this is something that is going to be useful to your organization and you've taken the time and the work to understand what it is you need to operate, then this is a really good place to say, hey, these are the threats that are facing our organization. Over the next 3 years, we expect an increase in this type of attack. We have this type of data that is critical to our success as a business. Here's some things we can put in place to monitor, to identify threats, and to continue to increase our security. They're much more likely to listen than if you just say like, hey, this thing is really cool and I want to buy it. So, in closing, open source feeds, free, as in puppies. Open source platforms, free. Open source reports, a lot of times they're free. Community tools, they have free, sometimes limited access, but you can definitely get some use out of them. But that solid foundation that you're going to build by actually going through the process and figuring out what is important to you and what works for you is priceless. And that means suddenly someone shows up tomorrow and says, woohoo, we have all the money in the world, which usually means you just got hacked, so sorry if that happens. You'll know what to do with it, and you'll know where to wisely invest your resources that you do have. If you have any questions, I think I have some time now. Otherwise, you can hit me up on Twitter or my email, and then I will put my slides up after this. I just listed all of the links to the different tools I mentioned in case anybody wants to take a picture. I have 2 slides too, so I'll wait till I see no more cameras, and then I will go to the next one. Any questions? Oh, yes.
Rebekah, is there any tool that will automatically look for useful banned IPs or naughty IPs and add them either to a Windows firewall or even better to an AWS security group?
There are several. So it depends on where you're looking for. I mean, when you say like looking for IPs, here's the second slide. Do you mean like running your own honeypots or just searching to see when new threats are popping up online?
When new threats are popping up online, I'd like them added to my AWS security group so I don't have to worry about much more.
So I am sure there are specific tools that do that. They will go by and aggregate the fields. You still have to kind of point them to what you want. Combine actually might be a good tool to do that because you can tell it what data feeds you want it to do. It won't really intuitively identify when new feeds pop up or a feed goes bad, so you will still have to monitor for that. But that's kind of what the point of it was, is to aggregate a bunch of different data feeds, specifically around things like IPs, and then put them into a format that you can use. And again, since it's open source, if you want to make it specifically for your AWS instance, you can probably tweak the code a bit to make it the output work with that.
Thanks.
No problem.
Hi.
Yes.
Yeah. So on your slide, how to spot a good threat report, there was something that seemed to be conspicuous by its absence, which is the thing that military intelligence people really like about confidence.
Yes.
So is there any reason why you didn't have that?
With like confidence in a threat report?
Yeah. So how confident you are in terms of percentages? 50% is perhaps, 75% is.
So what I've
probably.
found is, especially with the vendor type reports, they will always send that they report as high confidence. They will say, I wouldn't have given this to you if it wasn't high confidence. And then the other default is medium confidence, and which is kind of like, meh, it's not bad, it's not good. So I see those two things a lot. So I have a really hard time putting my faith in somebody else's confidence rating. And then again, it kind of comes down to the skill of understanding, okay, who is this person who's putting the report out? Are they telling me where the data came from? Do I know how old it is? And then I can kind of intuitively form my own confidence rating based on that. But again, it also, I think that when you're taking intelligence from someone else and you're trying to see how you can use it, you have to do that additional layer of analysis as well, because it's great to know what's the larger kind of global threat. But when you're trying to approach whether that threat is relevant to you specifically, you do have to do that own level analysis. And I think that's where you come in, you generate your own confidence. Does that make sense? Yeah. If anybody ever says like confidence level 5, I'm like, you didn't even try.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
In the risk equation, standard risk equation, there's a lot of metrics available on impact and vulnerability. Do you know of any work to score threat intelligence?
Yes. I'm blanking on what it is right now. I know there is, several people are trying to tackle that. So the vulnerabilities, I know that there's a lot of research into actually the vulnerabilities, and they take like the CVSS scores, and then they try and cross-reference that by whether it's, is it actually being exploited in the wild, or is it just a theoretical exploit, and then wrap that into, okay, well, if we've seen it, has it been used against a sophisticated adversary, or, is it an exploit kit, that type of thing. So people are trying to do this type of modeling. I don't think anybody has actually gotten it really solidly right to this point. And there's also been a lot of work where people have been trying to come up with processes and algorithms for indicator expiration as well, such as, okay, if it's an IP associated to this thread, it's good for 46 hours as opposed to this threat, which is only good for 2 hours. There's actually a lot of stuff out there on GitHub, a lot of people's in progress work that's out there on those, but I don't think there's anything solid that I would say this is spot on. But we're getting there. All right. Oh, yes.
What do you think a threat analyst's response to potentially deliberately misleading information should be? So, for example, something like the Guccifer 2 stuff, where potentially it was deliberately done in a way to look like something else.
Yes.
We don't necessarily have the tools to know what's going on.
Yes. So the question was, since Dominic didn't have a microphone, how should analysts handle potentially misleading information? Like the denial and deception, the example was the Guccifer 2.0, where we weren't doing the investigation. We don't have the tools to say one way or another. So how should we handle that? And that is a great application of the analysis of competing hypotheses, which is an intelligence model that Richard Heuer developed, I think in the 70s or something. I might have gotten the date wrong. But it's where you step through and you take the evidence that you do have available to you, and you come up with a set of different hypotheses. So for that particular hack, it was Guccifer 2.0 acting as a lone wolf. It was the Russians. It was, the DNC hacked themselves to make Donald Trump look bad. And you take all of those hypotheses and you run them against the evidence you have. And you say either it supports or it refutes that particular hypothesis. And in the end, you should probably have something where you have a bit more information to say, okay, this is the most likely scenario. It will never be 100%, especially if you don't have access to the actual log data and you only have what the information is out there in the media. But there is still, even when you don't know exactly who it was and you can't point the finger to it was this person or this group, there's still a lot that an analyst can learn from that type of situation, which is that it's kind of like what I took away from the DNC hack and all that was that it's kind of a changing, the game's changed as far as how the threat intelligence world is working. And now we have private organizations who are, calling out essentially nation states and what might the implications of that be. And we're seeing a lot more of the scapegoating type activity. And so it really changes the dynamic. And again, that's not something that you can always clearly articulate or always know 100% what happened, but there are still a lot of lessons you can learn from a situation like that. One more? Any other questions? All right, you guys might not have noticed, but at the very end, my daughter walked in. She's hiding in the back. So what you should all do is just talk about how awesome I am and how good I am at my job, because then she won't mind when I have to go out of town and don't get to take her to cool places like London. All right, well, thank you very much.